Hi Danny, Grace and Jude. This is the bolus insulin section. For me, this is probably one of the most important sections of the foundations because the information in here is going to be absolutely key to when we get to discussing dynamic glucose management, mealtime insulin guide and exercise. If you understand this and the foundations in here, I guarantee you it'll stand you in great stead as we move along. So let's begin. Bolus insulin. So bolus insulin can either be meal insulin, which is the insulin required from glucose that comes from the meal. And also bolus insulin can be a correction insulin where if the glucose level is high, extra insulin to bring it down back into target. So it can either be a meal bolus, a correction bolus, or both of these combined. But what we're going to focus on in this part is the meal bolus. So essentially how the insulin works, regardless of whichever fast-acting insulin it is, Novorapid, Fiasp, Humalog, Apidra, or even the more ultra rapid-acting ones. When you give them, they take about 90 minutes to 2 hours for peak action, and then are completed in 3 to 4 hours. So it's really important to understand it's only about 60% done after 2 hours, and the other 30 to 40% comes in the hours 3 to 4. This becomes really important when we discuss about matching food with insulin. So it's important to really understand this. The speed at which glucose is taken out of the blood peaks after 90 minutes to 2 hours, but the effect of a bolus for a meal bolus lasts up to 3 to 4 hours. So keep that in mind as we move along. How you work out how much insulin for a meal is by this simple formula. You count the grams of the carbohydrate in the meal, which we'll get to later, and you divide it by the grams in the carb ratio. So for example, if breakfast I'm on a 1 unit to 15 grams carbs ratio, I take 50 grams of carbs that I have for breakfast, divide it by the carbs part of the ratio, 15, it'll give me 3.3 units. So for the same 50 grams where my ratio is 1 to 25, it's much less insulin at 2 units. And then the evening meal, again, if that's somewhere in between at a ratio of 1 to 20, it's 2.5 units. So you'll often have a different carb ratio for breakfast, lunch and evening meal. You just need to apply a simple bit of maths, count the carbs, divide it by the grams in the carb ratio, and it'll give you the amount of insulin for that meal. How do you know whether your carb ratios are set correctly? Really important to test them to have an idea of is that 1 unit to 15 in my example for breakfast okay or not. So how you would test it is, the first thing is before the test you'd make sure you either had no food or no meal and no insulin in the 4 hours previous, so you don't have any of that previous insulin or meal affecting the glucose level. Make sure the meal is a balanced meal, not a high fat meal, so that we know that the meal's going in over a sort of 3 to 4 hours, similarly matching the insulin. We'll talk about how to manage high fat in the meal insulin guide. Make sure you give the insulin before the meal, and then keep your usual activity after eating. Don't do any crazy activity afterwards, which is going to bring the glucose level down, or potentially send it high if you do something really stressful. How you will know is if the insulin is not strong enough and you need to make the carb ratio a lot stronger to give more insulin, this is what it will look like. The glucose level will go high and it will stay high because the amount of glucose going in the blood is more than the glucose out of the blood from the insulin, from the meal. If you've got the perfect carb ratio, you will see that the glucose going in is matched by the glucose going out from the insulin. Whereas if the carb ratio is too strong, you'll see that the glucose level just drops down hyper after 2 to 3 hours. So that's how you can tell whether your ratios are set about right. And interestingly, what a lot of people, I'm sure Danny has picked up on this, is, well, if you've matched the insulin perfectly here, why do you still go from a level of about 4 or 5 up to 10 and back down, or 70 to 180 and back down? And that's a really good question, and that comes to, yes, you can have the right amount of insulin for a meal, but there's also other things you need to do to try and keep the CGM line as flat as possible, and that's what we're going to go through now. The first thing is you need to give insulin a head start. So if you can think of glucose from the meal is like a hare, it sets off and it's really quick, and insulin is like a tortoise, very slow, you're going to need to give the insulin a head start. And this is just a bit of a graph from a classic study which showed in the red line, if you give the insulin 20 minutes before eating, the glucose level only goes up by about 1 or 2 millimoles, 20 to 40 milligrams per deciliter, and then comes back down to target. So if you give the insulin 20 minutes before, you almost get a flat CGM profile. However, if you give the insulin at the meal or 20 minutes after, you can expect the glucose level to rise by 5 to 6 or 7 millimoles per litre, 100, 120 milligrams per deciliter, maybe 150. So you can see there's a huge difference on insulin timing is very important, giving the insulin before eating. And when we get into set of dynamic glucose management, we start even thinking about you can give the insulin even earlier than 20 minutes before, maybe 30, 40 minutes before if you're already high and trending up, or maybe only 5 minutes before if you're trending down. Those are the type of things we can do once we get into dynamic glucose management. But even still, we still get this sort of 1 to 2 or 3 millimole rise. Why does this happen for people without diabetes? With diabetes, but not for people without. And this next part for me is absolutely key to understand. This is what happens to a person without type 1 diabetes. You eat the meal that contains carbohydrate. The carbohydrate goes in, gets digested into glucose. It goes into the bloodstream, but here's the key thing. Before getting into the outer circulation, where you measure your finger prick, the glucose goes into the portal vein, which is a blood vessel which carries all the nutrients from the digestive tract to the liver. And where you can see where the pancreas is situated is right above the portal vein. So, as the glucose goes in, the glucose level rises, sends a message to the pancreas, a load of insulin is pushed into the portal vein, therefore the glucose and insulin trap or keep stored lots of glucose in the liver cells as glycogen. So a lot of the glucose never actually gets out into the bloodstream. That's a huge difference. So you've only got a little bit of circulating insulin in the outer bloodstream for people without diabetes and lots in the portal vein. Therefore, the glucose level in the outer circulation that you measure never really goes above 6.7 millimoles per litre or 120 milligrams per deciliter, because the pancreas is right above the portal vein and all the glucose from the meal is generally stored within the liver before getting a chance to go out. So now that we understand that, that's really important, because limited or low amounts of circulating insulin in the outer bloodstream means that there's not too much insulin that's leading to fat storage. Whereas when we get onto people with type 1 diabetes, that's slightly different and weight management becomes a bit more difficult. So here's the difference for people with type 1 diabetes. The same digestion process, carbohydrate foods go in, they get broken down, they go into the intestine, they go into the portal vein. But the difference here is there is very little insulin within the portal vein. Therefore, as the glucose goes through the liver, only a little bit goes into the liver cells and stored as glycogen. The vast majority gets out into the outer blood circulation, exactly where the insulin is put in from either injections or an insulin pump into the outer circulation. So, first of all, the glucose level is definitely going to go higher than 6.7 millimoles per litre, maybe up to 10, 11, 12. So you get a higher glucose level. And also, you've got a lot more insulin in the outer circulating blood system. Therefore, there's a lot more glucose being pushed into the muscle and fat cells, and a much higher chance of some of that being stored as body fat. So a person with type 1 diabetes, especially if they're on big insulin doses, they're going to be at a higher risk of storing fat. And it's also more difficult to actually lose fat once you've gained it. So we'll talk about a lot of strategies that you can do, exercise, keeping active to look after that. But what I want you to really focus on here is very limited insulin in the portal vein means that the glucose level will go higher after eating. And also there's going to be a higher circulating level of insulin in the bloodstream as well, which makes weight management more challenging. Alongside that, which another reason why you'll go high after eating, is within the pancreas there's lots of little depots, these beta cells that have insulin stored, so it pushes insulin out at a lot of entry points, therefore the insulin gets delivered very fast into the portal vein. Whereas when you give a big whack of insulin in one go at a mealtime, it clumps up in one big blob and then slowly gets infused into the bloodstream over time. So what we can think about is, rather than giving for large insulin doses, say above 10 units, giving it all in one go, you could split it into 2 injections, or you could do an extended bolus on a pump where you put half the insulin in before and half the insulin over 15 minutes, for example, would be a way to think about that. So you've also got a problem with absorption of insulin because of the way that it all goes into one big blob in the fat tissue, essentially. Things that you can do to try and make this situation better and speed up the action of insulin is just what we've talked about. The first one is large insulin doses, you can split them. So anything above 10 units on injections, you can consider doing 2 separate injections, 2 centimeters apart, to give the insulin a greater chance of being absorbed. Or if you're on an insulin pump, you can consider giving an extended bolus with half up front and half over the next 15 minutes. Obviously keeping away from lumpy fatty areas. This is the same amount of insulin injected into a lumpy area, the glucose level went high. Into a nice fresh site, the glucose level was much more in target. So having a good site rotation of where you put the insulin in. And this is probably the most important part. When you're giving your meal insulin, it needs to go into either the back of your arm or your abdomen, where the blood flow is very fast and very frequent. Therefore, the insulin will be absorbed very quickly. Whereas if you put it into your thigh or your buttocks, the blood flow to the area is much less. Therefore, the speed of insulin absorption is much slower. Therefore, the glucose level will go higher. So in summary from here is mealtime insulin into the arm or into the belly. Stay away from lumpy areas and rotate your sites, and split large doses of insulin above 10 units to give the absorption a much better chance. So that's a lot of information. So I'm just going to summarize the key things that you need to take away from here. It's possibly worth watching this video again because the information contained in here is going to set the foundations for the rest of the dynamic glucose management, mealtime insulin guide, and the exercise. So the first thing is meal boluses move glucose from the meal into the cells using a ratio of how many grams of carbs to a 1 unit to a certain number of grams carb ratio to get your units. Whereas correction insulin obviously moves the excess glucose into the cells. You can test the carb ratios by making sure you have a balanced meal and giving the insulin before and monitoring what happens over the next 4 hours. But here's the key thing. People with type 1 diabetes have very little insulin in the portal vein, therefore they miss the opportunity to store most of the glucose from the meal in the liver, and it gets stored in the muscle cells and the fat cells. And because the circulating level of insulin in the blood is much higher, it does make it more challenging for people with type 1 diabetes for weight management, especially if they gain weight in the first place. Losing weight can be very challenging. It is very possible. You need to be very active and look after your food, but people with type 1 diabetes have a harder job at losing weight for that particular reason. Key strategies: insulin before eating, split large doses, rotate your sites, and make sure that the belly is where you do the fast-acting insulin for the meal or the back of the arm. So that's a lot of information to take on board. Well worth looking over this a couple of times just to get to understand the importance of getting your bolus timings right and understanding how you can make the insulin work much faster to keep up with the meals and the fact that there's a lack of insulin in the portal vein.